All right, so picture this. You're coming up from a dive. Everything's going smoothly. You see your buddy, they give you the okay signal, and suddenly they double over, clutching their chest.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a dive you never forget, right?
Yeah.
And that brings us to today's deep dive, emergency oxygen.
Okay.
We're going to break down the why, when, and how of using it, especially for anyone out there working towards their rescue diver certification. Because trust me, you don't want to be caught in that situation without this knowledge.
Yeah, it's serious stuff.
Now, one thing that every manual seems to agree on is that if there's even a chance of decompression illness, you give oxygen. It's like diving first aid 101, am I right?
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Let's say it turns out not to be DCI later. Giving oxygen in that moment, it's not going to hurt anything. It's that just-in-case measure that you're thankful for.
It's like packing an extra pair of socks.
Yeah.
You never want to need them, but boy, are you glad when you do.
Exactly.
But speaking of things you don't want to need, the manuals also go into all these different oxygen delivery systems.
Yeah.
Honestly, some of them sound a little intimidating at first, like this, what is a non-resuscitator demand valve? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It does sound kind of intense, right?
Right.
But honestly, it's a lot simpler than it sounds.
Mhm.
Think of it like your regular scuba regulator, but instead of air, it's pure oxygen. And the demand part, that just means it only gives the oxygen when the diver inhales, makes it super efficient in an emergency. And don't worry, we'll get into the specifics of how to use it a bit later, but for now, just know it's designed to be as user-friendly as possible under pressure.
Okay, so efficient and user-friendly, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
But there was also a lot of talk about precautions, flammable materials, special lubricants. It's like we're dealing with nitroglycerin over here.
Well, you're not wrong to be cautious. Here's the thing. Oxygen itself, it's not flammable, but it makes everything else that is way more flammable. It's like, imagine a sparkler burning in the air, right? Now imagine that same sparkler in pure oxygen. Things get a whole lot more intense.
So handle with care. Got it.
Definitely.
Now, the material mentioned 3 main ways to actually give oxygen to someone underwater.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through those different scenarios?
Absolutely. It's kind of like having different tools in a first aid kit. Each one's for a different scenario, right?
Okay.
So scenario 1, you've got a conscious breathing diver, but maybe they're showing some signs of a diving-related injury. Could be anything from confusion to tingling in their arm. Something's just not right. In this case, you'd use that demand valve we talked about to give them the highest possible concentration of oxygen.
And that oxygen flowing. Makes sense. What about scenario 2?
So scenario 2, that's where things get a bit trickier. This is when you've got a diver who is struggling to breathe. Maybe they're gasping or their breaths are really shallow. This is when you'd use a non-rebreather mask with continuous oxygen flow. Now, this type of mask has a special reservoir bag that fills with oxygen. That way, even if the diver can't take those nice deep breaths, they're still getting a constant oxygen supply.
So it's like giving their breathing a little boost.
Exactly. Now, scenario 3, this is the most critical. We're talking about a non-breathing diver. This is where all that CPR training comes in.
Okay, so this is serious stuff. What do we do?
All right, so in this scenario, you'll be using a rescue breathing mask with an oxygen inlet. This lets you give extra oxygen with every single rescue breath. And just remember, in this situation, time is absolutely critical. Every second matters.
Wow. That is a lot to remember when you're in that high-pressure situation.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for someone like me who's still getting the hang of all this?
You know what they say, practice makes perfect. But really the key here is to visualize. Picture different emergency scenarios in your head. Imagine yourself grabbing your oxygen unit, putting it together calmly, and talking the injured diver through each step. The more you practice, even if it's just in your head, the more prepared and confident you'll be when it counts.
Solid advice. So as a soon-to-be rescue diver, what's the one thing I should really take away from all of this?
In a diving emergency, every second counts. Knowing how to give oxygen and knowing when to give it could be the difference between a positive outcome and a tragic one.
Knowledge is power. I like it. Now, you mentioned the non-rebreather mask, but what about those bag valve mask systems, the ones you see in hospitals? Where do those fit in underwater?
That's a great question, and it really highlights something important about diving emergencies. Just because a piece of equipment is great in one situation doesn't mean it's the best choice underwater.
So you're saying those bag valve masks, or BVMs, as I think the pros call them, they're not ideal for diving emergencies. Why is that?
Not ideal, is putting it mildly. BVMs are amazing tools for paramedics up on the surface. Versatile, reliable, they can pump out a ton of oxygen, But take them underwater, and you've got a whole new set of challenges.
Because everything's more complicated down there.
You got it. Remember we were talking about breathing resistance with those demand valves? Well, that resistance, it gets amplified underwater. Trying to breathe through a BVM at depth takes serious effort, which is the last thing you want for a diver who's already in trouble.
So it's like trying to breathe through a straw while swimming laps.
Yeah,
Not exactly a recipe for success.
you got it. And then there's the other risk with BVMs underwater. Water getting in the system. Even a little bit of water in that mask or the tubing can make it almost impossible for the diver to breathe.
Okay, so we can rule out BVMs. We've got our demand valves and non-rebreather masks. But what about the actual process of giving someone oxygen? Is it as simple as just putting on the mask?
If only it were that easy. Remember, we're dealing with someone who's probably scared, probably disoriented, maybe dealing with a serious medical issue. How you communicate, how you stay calm, that's just as important as the oxygen itself.
So talk them through it even if they don't seem totally with it.
Exactly. Even if they can't really respond back to you, just hearing a calm, reassuring voice, that can make all the difference. Explain what you're doing, why you're doing it. Let them know help is on the way.
Got it. So talk them through it, stay calm. What about the actual mechanics of giving oxygen? How do you actually do it?
Okay, so let's break it down by scenario. With a conscious breathing diver, once you've explained what's going on, you're going to gently put that mask over their mouth and nose. Get a good seal, just like with a regular dive mask.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about if they're struggling to breathe?
All right, so for a diver who's weakly breathing, you're using that non-rebreather mask. Keep a close eye on their breathing, adjust the oxygen flow rate as needed. You want that reservoir bag to be inflating with each breath, but not overinflating. It shouldn't be hard for them to exhale.
Sounds like a balancing act. Okay, so for a non-breathing diver,
That's when your CPR training really kicks in. You'll use the rescue breathing mask with the oxygen inlet. The key here is maintaining a good seal on the mask while you're giving those rescue breaths. You're essentially breathing for them, and that oxygen-enriched air is buying precious time until the EMTs arrive.
okay, so we've covered the why, when, and how of giving oxygen. But what are some of those telltale signs and symptoms that scream, we need oxygen and we need it now? Okay, so we know getting oxygen to a diver quickly is critical. But what should we be looking for? What are the signs that someone needs oxygen?
That's where you come in. You have to be observant,
Yeah.
look for anything that seems off, and honestly trust your gut. Something feels wrong, it probably is.
So don't be afraid to speak up.
Exactly. Don't wait for someone to turn blue or pass out. You're looking for those more subtle cues, unusual fatigue, dizziness, any tingling or weakness.
Yeah, those could be easy to miss, especially after a long dive. You might just think you're tired.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to pay attention. Those seemingly minor things could be your buddy's way of saying, hey, something's not right. Also watch out for things like difficulty coordinating movements, difficulty thinking clearly, or any sudden personality changes. Those are some big red flags.
So basically, if someone's acting strangely after a dive, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Absolutely. And of course, don't forget the more obvious signs like trouble breathing, chest pain, coughing.
I sound a bit more serious.
They are. And in those situations, you want to administer oxygen right away while calling for help. Like we said before, every second counts.
This has been seriously eye-opening.
Yeah.
So to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways about emergency oxygen that our listeners should remember?
Number one, in a diving emergency, every second counts. Knowing how to give oxygen, when to give it. That could be the difference between a positive outcome and a tragic one.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Number two, practice, practice, practice. Get comfortable with your oxygen unit. Run through those emergency scenarios in your head until those steps become second nature.
Because when the pressure's on, you fall back on your training.
Exactly. And finally, never ever underestimate the power of staying calm and reassuring that injured diver. Your calmness can help them stay calm, which is absolutely crucial in a stressful situation.
So be prepared, stay calm, be that steady presence that your buddy might need.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into emergency oxygen for divers. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and more importantly, feel prepared to handle those just-in-case scenarios. Remember, dive, safe dive prepared, and until next time, happy bubbles.